What's up, everybody? It is the Dark Conservatarian, and I am back with another, hopefully quicker than the last two, debate review today. Now, this debate review is about a recent debate that I watched just today, actually, and it was one that was hosted on Gothix channel. I'm a subscriber of Gothix, and she hosted this with Michael Moreno moderating, funnily enough. And she was debating alongside with Karlyn Borysenko, who I'm also subscribed to, and a guy called Christian Watson, against these two other people named Aaron and Sam. I cannot remember what their last names are, but whatever. And essentially these three were debating against them two on the issue of critical race theory. And of course, Gothix and her team were on the anti-critical race theory side, and Aaron and Sam were on the pro-critical race theory side. And might I just say full out that in spite of how much that I was siding with the anti-CRT side, I cannot help but, I guess, overall give the W to the pro-CRT side. But it's not a very substantive W that I'm giving them, because they honestly, in the ultimatum of things, weren't able to give like a solid definition of what critical race theory really is. I mean, Karlyn, she says that she gave a straightforward definition at her opening statement. She claimed that in a little video that she made, titled "Here I Give a Solid Definition," or whatever the exact title of that video is. And but in that video, she gives her own little definition, essentially that it is the assumption that racism is essentially in everything, and it's not a question of if, but a question of how racism is involved in XYZ facet of regular day-to-day life. And yeah, the pro-CRT side, they could not give a solid definition. Even though this was what the debate was supposed to be about, was critical race theory, we could not really get to the nub of the issue. Instead, the debate panel kept on going on some tangents that were related to racism and CRT somewhat, but it wasn't that productive in the grand scheme of things, because of nobody was given none of the pro-CRT sides was given a solid definition anyways. Sam, excuse me. I keep on confusing Aaron and Sam with each other. I don't know, maybe it's because there are a couple of stereotypical white hipsters that sound essentially the same with the same accent, why I'm confusing the two. But no, teasing aside though. But I think it was Sam. Sam, at the end of the debate, even though he kept on insisting that supposedly he was given a solid definition of what CRT is, I still did not hear the straightforward definition. In fact, as he was trying to respond to them of how he supposedly did give a definition of CRT, he was explaining it's a cluster of concepts. Those are his words. He explained it as it being a cluster of concepts. There is one earlier point in the stream, in the debate, in which he explained that CRT is an academic movement, which that isn't exactly a solid definition. I mean, you could technically call third wave feminism a form of an academic movement in some fashion or another, but that doesn't mean that it's the same thing as CRT. So to just say that it's an academic movement, which I'm not saying that that is exactly what they're just calling it, but nonetheless, that meant nothing. That meant almost nothing by itself anyways, saying that it's an academic movement. But going more towards the end, he kept on saying essentially that he was given a definition, but really he wasn't. And he just kept on saying that it's a cluster of concepts. Which means that goes to tell me that he's basically implying an admission that he can't really define it. At least not in simple, straightforward terms, in the same way as anti-CRT people are able to. So I think this is something that would do best for pro-CRT, to find a solid definition that they could actually fit in a dictionary, basically. That is utilizable, that and can be fit into a little section of a dictionary, instead of it being like a full-on 3-page essay on what we call it. But yeah, the way that he was defining it, it seemed to me that he was defining it in the same funky-ass way that Richard Wolff was defining socialism in his debate against Destiny, where that he was all like, well, there are 3 different definitions of socialism, and yeah, just not really giving what definition he was subscribing to. He was just sort of motor-mouthing and filibustering the moment, in the same way that it almost seems like Sam kind of was in his attempting to define of what CRT is. But nonetheless, it was disappointing because it wasn't very substantive in that area. But if I had to scrounge out some kind of vague implication of a definition that they were giving, I almost get the implication that what is part of CRT, or the best that I could gather what they were agreeing on, of what both sides of the panel were agreeing on to be part of CRT, is essentially the belief that there's systemic racism, white privilege exists, and possibly even the essentialism of race baiting people. Baiting people over race. Like, for example, just as a very vague example, people in the beginning of Obama's tenure were saying that if you dislike Barack Obama as president, it's because that he's black and you don't like black people or whatever. When really that's not the case. Just as a very brief example, there are of course other stronger examples of people race baiting, but nonetheless, it just seems to be all these things I mentioned that I could get, the best thing that I could get as to how that they were defining CRT, essentially just seemed to be like plain standard normie left liberal beliefs that have pretty much always existed in the modern day discourse of American politics ever since the 90s and onward. And of course, CRT wasn't a self-ascribed thing to wasn't what people were really prescribing their beliefs to be back then. In fact, I would go on to say that yes, CRT, I'll just give the benefit of the doubt, it might have been invented sometime in the 70s, that little concept, but it hasn't been really popularized and self-acclaimed as part of people's belief systems until, I'd say, 2019 at the earliest. But even then, I'd say it's probably not till 2020 when people started describing themselves as CRT advocates or whatever. So it just seems to me that from what I could possibly gather of this debate was that CRT is just normal left-leaning liberal beliefs when it comes to race and the race narrative here in America, just with a fluffy new package to make it seem academic and sophisticated, so that maybe people would accept the leftist racial narrative of American politics a little bit easier. But yeah, but probably the biggest reason why I say that the pro-CRT side won vaguely, barely, was mostly because there were some things that they were mentioning that I wish that the anti-CRT side had responded to and rebutted a little bit harder and more often to. Karlyn was trying to rebut some things, but she wasn't exactly putting good optics on the anti-CRT side. Like, she was just throwing around personal attacks and insults a little bit too often. Like, I'm not saying that pro-CRT was free of this, but Karlyn was the worst at it from what I could remember of the live stream. Although I will say that Aaron and Sam, the pro-CRT side, that they were the most smug and passive-aggressive and arrogant, I would say, in their attitudes. They were more passive with their bad optics, whereas Karlyn was a little bit more direct with her bad optics that she was showing. But anyway, for an example of what I think that anti-CRT should have rebutted pro-CRT more on, one thing that is more important to the debate, like a lot of things that they were rebutting, that they did not rebut, that pro-CRT brought up and anti-CRT did not rebut, was not that relevant in the grand scheme of things and the subject of CRT and defining it and its usefulness and whatever. But except for one of them being about Martin Luther King. Like Sam had pulled a quote from Martin Luther King about how he was criticizing, supposedly Sam was like summarizing Martin Luther King's quote to be some quote against white people. It was more against the white liberal from what I was hearing of him actually quoting MLK to be but the way that he surmised that MLK, I do not think it's quite an accurate summation, but nonetheless, even if I was to give the benefit of the doubt though, that MLK is his beliefs were the way that Sam was essentially trying to characterize MLK's beliefs to be, I would say that it's more relative towards his time, about how he thinks that white people, as a generality, are not speaking out against racism, or not, of how the system, I think that it was more about the system. I watched the debate, but I do not remember word for word what was actually said on there, people. But nonetheless, it was about systemic racism and how white people are not spoken out against it enough. And I would say that the reason why Martin Luther King was saying that was because it was more relative to his time. His beliefs were more relative to its time. And at that time, there still existed Jim Crow laws where that businesses were not only allowed, but in a lot of cases, mandated to discriminate against black people and other sort of non-white minorities as well. Not to mention the police practices being a little bit more overtly harsh against black people and so on and so forth. So that would be that would have been the response that I would have given, essentially, roughly along the lines to the way that Sam was pulling MLK, the quote of MLK right there, and how he's characterizing it. And I wish that anti-CRT rebutted him on that, but they didn't, and so it's just, I gotta subtract points from anti-CRT in all honesty about that. So overall, I say that pro-CRT won. Now, it's not to say that I am convinced that CRT is a thing that we should accept and whatnot. I'm actually in the middle of watching the debate that Aaron and Sam have against PSA Sitch and Adam. And even in that debate, Aaron and Sam are not really giving a solid definition. There was one point in which they were supposedly saying that they were about to give a definition, but they still kind of dodged around that and didn't really give a direct, digestible answer as to what simple definition they put with CRT. But nonetheless, I think that's all that I have to say, aside from the fact that Aaron and Sam, too passive aggressive and too arrogant. It just would I call them respectable as far as debating goes? I mean, with what they were actually saying, and if you are like somebody who's on the pro-CRT side, then because of them not directly insulting anybody and because of the rhetoric that they espouse, you're definitely going to think that they won and learn to like them or whatever. But it's just a passive-aggressive, arrogant attitude that makes them really unlikable to me anyways. They're coming off as less so in this debate that they're having with Sitch and Adam that I'm still in the middle of watching. But anyway, so yeah. I think that's all I have to say. Go check it out yourself. I mean, really, it's the end of that live stream that is the most revealing part of the beliefs of CRT and whatnot. But anyway, so for all of y'all who have been wondering, yes, I am back and doing YouTube content creation again. So stick around and find out, and see y'all later. I'm going to go inside and do my grocery shopping right now. God bless and good evening.